The winter of 1942 was the kind that broke machines and men alike. In the vast white emptiness of the Eastern Front, where even sound seemed to freeze in the air, an experiment was about to take place that would leave a group of German engineers speechless. In a makeshift testing ground outside Smolensk, a captured Soviet T-34 tank stood half buried in snow, its green armor turned ghostly beneath a thick coat of frost. The temperature had dropped to nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that turned oil to sludge and fuel to crystal. The engineers had been ordered to examine the vehicle, to understand why the Red Army's tanks refused to die. Reports from the front described Soviet armor moving through snowdrifts where German machines froze solid. Entire panzer battalions had been found immobilized, their engines locked in ice while T-34s rolled past, their exhausts glowing against the night. The high command wanted answers, and the men gathered around the captured tank intended to find them. They began by inspecting the engine compartment. Beneath a layer of frost and grime, the Soviet design was brutally simple. The 12-cylinder diesel engine sat exposed, its components larger and rougher than anything German engineers would have approved of. There was no polish here, no precision fitting, no delicate machining. To the German eye, it was crude, but crude had its advantages. Where German engines demanded warmth and care, the T-34's I-2 engine seemed built to fight the elements themselves. The team drained the old oil and fuel, replacing them with fresh supplies. Then they examined the filters, the wiring, the fuel pump. Everything looked basic, even primitive. Yet it was this very simplicity that intrigued them. The design lacked the fragility of German engineering. There were no fine tolerances to season the cold, no delicate joints to crack under pressure. It looked almost agricultural, as if it had been designed by farmers rather than engineers. As the light faded, the air grew even colder. Frost gathered on the men's coats, their breath forming thick clouds. They knew that at this temperature, a Maybach engine, the heart of any German tank, would be dead metal. Even preheating systems struggled below minus 20. They had seen countless panzers frozen solid overnight, but now, as they prepared to test the T-34, they were about to witness something that defied every rule they knew. They filled the tank's fuel system with the thick, pungent Soviet diesel and primed the engine. The sound of the crankshaft turning cut through the silence. Slow, heavy, reluctant at first. Then after a few seconds, the engine coughed. A puff of dark smoke burst from the exhaust, followed by another, then a deep, steady rumble that rolled through the frozen forest. The German engineers stared in disbelief. The T-34 had started. Steam rose from the vents, the engine warming itself as though awakening from hibernation. The diesel fuel, thick but stable, burned with unwavering rhythm. The exhaust plumed into the air, and the snow around the tank began to melt. The engineers gathered closer, their faces illuminated by the soft orange glow from the exhaust flames. They took measurements, checked temperatures, examined vibrations. Everything was stable. The Soviet machine had endured conditions that paralyzed the best of German design. Its thick oil lines, wide fittings, and coarse machining, once dismissed as signs of inferiority, were now the very things that kept it alive in the cold. When they finally shut it down, the silence that followed was absolute. The tank sat in a halo of melted snow, its metal steaming in the moonlight. What they had seen was not luck nor accident. It was intent, the deliberate result of engineering designed for a land that knew no mercy. For years, German industry had chased perfection through precision. But here, in the heart of a Russian winter, perfection had frozen solid, and simplicity had survived. The men recorded their results carefully. Their notes would be sent to Berlin, though few there would truly understand their significance. The T-34 was more than a tank. It was an idea, one born not in factories of luxury, but in the brutal necessity of survival. And in that frozen forest, surrounded by silence and snow, the German engineers realized something both humbling and terrifying. The Soviets had built a machine that didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to live. The next morning, the cold deepened to a degree that defied comprehension. The thermometer at the test site read minus 34 degrees Celsius, But in the biting wind, it felt closer to -40. Metal cracked under stress, and oil inside German equipment had turned solid overnight. Even the breath of the engineers froze to their scarves. Yet there, in the clearing beyond the huts, the captured T-34 stood waiting, an unearthly shape half hidden beneath a fresh shroud of snow. The German engineers had slept poorly, their thoughts circling back to what they had witnessed the night before. A tank that could start in such cold seemed like a contradiction of nature itself. Every tank in their own arsenal, from the Panzer III to the Panther, required delicate preheating units, coolant circulation, and hours of preparation before the first turn of the crank. The T-34 had done it in less than a minute. The men needed to understand why. As the sun rose, pale, weak, and nearly useless for warmth, they began a full inspection. The diesel engine's cover was lifted, its exposed surfaces shining with a film of frost that glimmered like glass. The engineers began measuring fuel viscosity, compression ratios, and cylinder temperatures. What astonished them most was how quickly the T-34's V2 diesel maintained uniform pressure. Even after freezing overnight, there were no hairline fractures in the casing, no seized pistons, no warped metal. Its rough casting had survived what would have destroyed any German engine of similar output. They discovered other secrets too. The Soviets had used an alloy that retained ductility in low temperatures. A manganese steel blend, far less brittle than the finely machined German parts. Where the Germans relied on precision, the Soviets relied on forgiveness. A few millimeters of tolerance in the right place allowed the T-34's components to expand and contract freely as the temperature changed. It was design born not from luxury, but from necessity, the kind of engineering that understood failure and made peace with it. When the engineers examined the fuel system, they found more small miracles. The fuel pump was shockingly basic, with large valves and thick pipes that allowed diesel to flow even when half frozen. Unlike gasoline engines, which relied on volatile vapors easily lost in the cold, diesel burned slow and steady. It was heavier, yes, but also more resilient. The Soviets had turned that resilience into an advantage, one that let their tanks move when others stood frozen and helpless. They noted the shape of the engine bay, too. Every corner, every component was positioned for access. The T-34 had been designed for mechanics with numb fingers and little time, for soldiers fixing machines by the glow of burning villages. There were no luxury fittings, no unnecessary panels, nothing that would require hours to remove. To the German eye, it was almost crude, but to the Soviet soldier, it was perfect. As the test continued, the engine was restarted, again and again without fail. The engineers watched the pressure gauges rise as the diesel came to life, the steady rhythm of combustion echoing across the snow. The tank shook with life, each piston stroke pulsing like a heartbeat. Around it, their own trucks and generators lay dead, victims of the very cold the Soviet machine seemed to mock. They ran the engine for over an hour, monitoring every vibration and temperature change. When they finally shut it down, not one of the Germans spoke. Their notebooks were full, their instruments cold to the touch. But what they had witnessed was clear. The T-34 wasn't just durable, it was built for a world that would kill anything less. As dusk fell, they gathered in their hut to write their reports. The air inside was heavy with the smell of fuel and frost. Their notes described not only the T-34's mechanical details, but also what those details meant. A tank built to survive at any cost, even when its crew could barely stand. That night, as the wind screamed outside and temperatures fell even further, the engineers could still hear the echo of that diesel engine in their minds. A sound that, in its simplicity and defiance, told them something profound. The Soviet secret was not genius, it was endurance. By the third day, the German engineers had begun to grasp what the T-34 truly represented, a kind of mechanical philosophy completely foreign to their own. While German tanks were born in workshops of precision and pride, the Soviet machine had been forged in the crucible of survival. The T-34's powertrain was not a triumph of refinement, but of resilience. It was not meant to impress engineers. It was meant to endure war. The air that morning was brittle and thin. A low fog rolled across the test site, cloaking everything in white silence. The engineers moved slowly, their faces wrapped in scarves, their boots stiff with frost. Their instruments froze faster than they could read them. Yet the T-34 sat unmoved, its metal dull beneath the frost, but strangely alive, as though defying the winter itself. They began a stress test, pushing the tank's systems to failure. Fuel lines were intentionally left exposed. The coolant was replaced with untreated water. The lubricants were chilled to the point of freezing. Under any other circumstances, such treatment would have destroyed an engine. But when they attempted to start the T-34 again, it roared back to life with the same steady defiance as before. The diesel engine, they realized, had one decisive advantage. It generated immense heat almost immediately. Within minutes, the surrounding metal was warm to the touch. The Germans took readings. The exhaust temperature climbed steadily, melting the frost around the hull. Inside, the cooling system circulated slowly but consistently, the water not freezing despite the sub-zero air. It was as if the tank carried its own heartbeat, a mechanical metabolism tuned for survival. They compared their data with that of their own Maybach HL-230 engine, the same power plant that drove the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks. On paper, the Maybach was far superior. More horsepower, higher torque, smoother operation. But in reality, the precision that gave it such power made it fragile. A single drop in temperature could alter metal tolerances, causing pistons to seize and bearings to crack. The T-34, rough and uneven, simply adapted. In the workshop, they dismantled part of the Soviet engine, laying its components on the frozen ground. The pistons were thick, the walls of the cylinders coarse, the fittings loose by German standards. Yet every imperfection had a purpose. Where the Germans saw inefficiency, the Soviets saw immunity, the ability for dirt, ice, and mud to exist within the system without destroying it. It was an engine meant for battlefields, not factories. They inspected the air filters next. Instead of the complex, layered designs used in Panzer engines, the T-34 used a simple oil bath filter that trapped dust and ice with surprising effectiveness. It was low maintenance, easy to clean, and could be serviced with the most basic tools. Every discovery made the same statement. This was a machine built to be used by soldiers who might never see a workshop. As the test continued, the engineers began to see the pattern that defined Soviet design. It was not carelessness. It was a deliberate choice to build machines that worked under conditions where men barely could. Every bolt, every joint, every tube served that singular goal. By late afternoon, the cold had begun to claim their own vehicles. A generator failed, its crankcase cracked open by expanding ice. A Panzer truck nearby refused to start, but the T-34 kept running, its diesel growl constant and calm, as if mocking the machines around it. One of the engineers scribbled into his notebook, "Their engineering is barbaric, but it works. It works when ours fails." They let the tank run until darkness fell, the glow of its exhaust faintly lighting the snow. It was a strange sight, a Soviet engine breathing warmth into a frozen German camp. The men stood around it in silence, each lost in thought. That night, as the temperature plunged below minus 35 degrees Celsius, the tank's metal popped and groaned as it cooled. Yet when the morning came, and the key was turned once more, it came to life as if the night's cold had never happened. The engineers no longer laughed. They had seen the impossible, and it was made of steel, frost, and simplicity. By the fourth day, the German engineers no longer viewed the T-34 as a crude curiosity. It had become an obsession, a mystery wrapped in frost and diesel fumes. The more they studied it, the more they realized that its brilliance lay not in perfection, but in restraint. Every element of the tank seemed to whisper the same brutal logic. Make it simple, make it survive. The test ground had become a landscape of contradictions. Around the T-34, the snow was trampled and blackened by soot, while beyond that circle of activity, the world remained untouched, white, still, and lifeless. The German vehicles parked nearby stood frozen, their engines cracked or seized. Mechanics had spent hours trying to revive a Panzer IV, only to fail. Meanwhile, the Soviet machine waited silently, ready to move at a moment's notice. The engineers began their next round of experiments by measuring the tank's cold start performance under repeated cycles. They deliberately left it outside all night, exposed to wind and snow, the temperature dropping again to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The next morning, the engineers stood watching as one of their own climbed aboard, flipped the magneto, and engaged the starter. Within seconds, the deep, guttural rumble of the diesel engine filled the air. It was as if the machine were taunting them, a growl from something that refused to die. When they examined the oil after the start, they found it still fluid, dark and viscous, but flowing. Soviet engineers had chosen a low-grade lubricant that retained movement even when chilled, unlike the refined German oils that thickened to tar in the same cold. This, the Germans realized, was part of the secret. Soviet design accepted inefficiency to gain reliability. The fuel and oil were never meant to perform perfectly, only to perform no matter what. They moved next to the cooling system. The T-34's simple radiator design circulated liquid through wide channels, almost impossible to clog with ice. Instead of relying on complex pumps, it depended on the engine's own vibrations and pressure differences to move coolant. Crude, yes, but brilliant in its practicality. Even with frozen slush in the system, it kept functioning. Around noon, the engineers tried to replicate the test on a German Maybach unit mounted on a rig. They preheated the oil, primed the carburetors, and carefully turned the crank. Nothing. The engine groaned once, then froze. Its finely tuned pistons, perfect for summer operations in France, had become rigid in the Russian winter. The men turned back toward the T-34, where exhaust smoke still curled upward into the gray sky. The realization began to settle in. The Soviets had engineered not for precision, but for survival. And survival here was worth more than elegance. The study expanded. They recorded every dimension of the T-34's engine bay. The position of its air intake, the thickness of its armor near the motor, even the flexibility of the mounting brackets. Nothing was wasted. Every detail served a purpose, whether to trap heat or shed ice. The welded seams were rough but strong, the design unsophisticated but effective. Later that evening, Kruger, the lead engineer, wrote in his report that the T-34's success lay not only in its construction, but in its philosophy. It reflected the nation that built it, a country that understood endurance better than any other. He compared it to the German war machine, built on the belief that precision equaled superiority. But here on the frozen front, that belief had met its match. As the temperature dropped again with the setting sun, they left the T-34 to rest one more night in the open. The camp grew quiet. Snow fell in slow, heavy sheets, blanketing everything in silence. The next morning, they repeated the test. No maintenance, no preheating, no preparation. Just the turn of a crank. The diesel roared to life instantly. The sound rolled across the white plains like thunder. The German engineers didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They had just witnessed a machine that defied their understanding of engineering itself. A tank built not for glory, but for endurance. And as the exhaust smoke drifted upward, gray against the dawn, one truth became undeniable. In this war, the side that could endure the cold would outlast the side that worshipped perfection. On the fifth day, the camp woke beneath a sky so pale it seemed drained of color. The snow had fallen without pause through the night, burying vehicles and equipment under a smooth white shroud. The German engineers moved like shadows through the haze, stamping their boots and brushing frost from their instruments. Only one thing broke the monotony of the landscape: the T-34, standing dark and unbothered amid the drifts, its shape dusted with snow, but defiant against the cold. By now, the engineers' initial curiosity had hardened into professional obsession. Their reports to Berlin had already sparked interest within the higher ranks of the Wehrmacht's technical division, and orders had arrived to conduct further stress tests. They were to learn everything about how the T-34 endured, and, if possible, how its secrets could be replicated. The morning began with another test, this time to measure the T-34's performance after prolonged idling in sub-zero temperatures. The tank was left to run at low throttle for hours, consuming minimal fuel while maintaining steady internal warmth. When the Germans checked the readings, they were stunned. The T-34's diesel maintained consistent pressure, its temperature rising slowly but never dangerously. The heat circulated evenly throughout the system, keeping vital components above freezing. It was a balance that no German vehicle could match. Their own engines required constant adjustment. Fuel mixtures altered, carburetors heated, coolant drained nightly to prevent freezing. The T-34 required none of it. The longer it ran, the stronger it seemed to become. Kruger noted that the Soviets had mastered something subtle yet profound: the harmony between simplicity and sustainability. They didn't build for perfection. They built for the inevitable, for broken parts, bad fuel, frozen oil, and mud-choked roads. Their designs anticipated failure and absorbed it. Later in the day, the team decided to dismantle the fuel injectors to study their mechanism. What they found was almost laughably unsophisticated: large tolerances, coarse threads, and sturdy construction that allowed the injectors to function even with debris or ice crystals present. A German engineer would have called them flawed. But in this frozen land, where everything delicate shattered, flawed meant indestructible. The more they learned, the more they realized that the T-34's success was inseparable from its environment. Its designers had not built a tank for showrooms or parades. They had built a machine for Siberia, for the endless plains, for the kind of cold that made a man forget his own name. Every part of the tank reflected that, from the wide treads that glided over snow to the sealed hull that retained heat like a furnace. In the afternoon, a storm rolled in from the east. Wind howled through the camp, tearing at tents and scattering snow like ash. The engineers struggled to protect their instruments, but the cold was relentless. By dusk, the temperature had fallen to minus 38 degrees Celsius. The storm showed no mercy. They left the T-34 where it stood, half buried in snowdrifts, its engine off and its metal groaning under the weight of the ice. They retreated to the barracks, convinced that no machine on Earth could survive such conditions. But when the storm finally broke the next morning, and the sky cleared to an impossible blue, the T-34 remained. It stood silent and strong, coated in a crystalline layer of frost. When the engineers brushed away the snow, the metal beneath was intact. Not cracked, not warped, not broken. They turned the starter. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a low rumble built beneath the armor, a vibration deep and steady. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life, as if the storm had been nothing more than a night's rest. Steam burst from the exhaust, and the snow around the tank began to melt. Kruger wrote in his log that evening, "It is not a machine, it is an animal. It sleeps, it breathes, and when it wakes, it is alive again." The German engineers, once so confident in their mastery of precision, began to see the irony written across the snow. The Soviets had beaten them not with brilliance, but with pragmatism. And as the T-34 rumbled softly through the dawn light, the men watching understood something unsettling: that in the war of endurance, the simplest engine had already won. By the sixth day, the test site had transformed into a kind of frozen laboratory of revelation. The T-34 stood at its center like an artifact from another civilization, one whose principles defied everything the German engineers had been taught to believe. Around it, their own machinery lay silent, buried under snowdrifts, their sleek engines useless in the biting cold. The contrast was humiliating and mesmerizing all at once. The morning began with renewed determination. Kruger ordered a full endurance run, not just another cold start test, but a complete operational trial. The engineers wanted to see how long the T-34's engine could sustain itself under constant operation in freezing temperatures. They filled the tank's reserves with Soviet-grade diesel, thick and foul-smelling, and checked the oil one last time. Then, as the pale winter sun climbed over the horizon, they brought the beast to life once again. The diesel engine responded instantly, roaring to life with the same steady confidence it had shown for days. The rhythmic pounding of its 12 cylinders filled the clearing. Clouds of exhaust rose into the sky, creating a plume of warmth in the frozen air. The vibrations could be felt through the ground itself, a deep, living pulse against the stillness of the forest. For the next 6 hours, the T-34 ran without pause. The German engineers monitored every detail: fuel consumption, oil pressure, coolant temperature, exhaust output. The data they gathered painted a picture that defied logic. The T-34's systems operated not only efficiently, but with remarkable stability. Even as temperatures dropped to minus 33 degrees Celsius, the readings remained consistent. The longer the test went on, the clearer the pattern became. The Soviet engine design did not fight the cold. It accepted it. Its low compression ratios and wide tolerances allowed it to operate despite ice buildup and partial freezing. Where German engines would seize, the T-34s merely slowed and then resumed as if nothing had happened. By midday, frost had formed thick layers along the tank's hull. The snow that had fallen overnight now melted away near the exhaust, leaving dark circles of exposed earth. The contrast between the living heat of the machine and the deathly chill of the land around it was striking. The engineers began studying the maintenance intervals next. They removed panels, checked for wear, and measured stress on the components. What they found was astonishing: minimal degradation, no cracks, and steady lubrication throughout. The diesel had thickened, but it hadn't stopped flowing. The T-34's components were built to tolerate imperfection, to endure dirt and moisture without collapse. Kruger's notes became more reflective as the day went on. He wrote that the tank's endurance mirrored the soldiers who operated it: rugged, unyielding, and capable of surviving conditions that no one else could. He realized that this was more than a machine. It was an extension of Soviet warfare itself, an embodiment of resilience. As evening fell, the test ended. The engine was shut down, and silence returned to the clearing. The air shimmered faintly with heat, the last breath of the diesel lingering in the cold. The Germans stood watching as frost began to reclaim the metal, slowly creeping over the surface like white lace. They were tired now, not from the cold or the work, but from what they had learned. Each day stripped away another layer of their certainty. The belief that precision and elegance defined superiority had begun to crumble. What they faced here was something more fundamental: adaptability. That night, as the engineers huddled in their barracks, the T-34 sat alone outside, its silhouette faint under the moonlight. The wind howled across the plain, lifting snow in ghostly waves. Yet within the stillness, the memory of the tank's engine still echoed, a deep, relentless heartbeat that refused to fade. In their reports, the men began to choose their words carefully. They could not write superior, nor could they call it inferior. The T-34 was something else entirely, an answer to a different question, one that German engineering had never asked. It was not about how to make a machine perfect, it was about how to make it live. By the seventh day, the German engineers had lost all sense of mockery. When the T-34 had first arrived at the depot, they had regarded it as a crude curiosity, a product of desperation, not design. But now, standing before it in the biting wind, they saw it for what it truly was: the embodiment of a different kind of intelligence. It was a machine built for war, not in theory, but in practice. A weapon forged by hardship itself. The sky was a dull gray that morning, the light dim and lifeless. The men moved carefully through the snow, their breath fogging in the air as they set up the next series of endurance tests. They had already proven that the T-34 could start and run in the cold. Now they wanted to understand how it moved through it, how this tank could advance across terrain that swallowed other vehicles whole. They cleared a path through the drifts and marked out a stretch of ground, a mixture of ice, frozen mud, and deep snow. To the German eye, it looked impassable. No Panzer would have dared cross it. But when the T-34's engine roared to life once more, the sound rolled through the forest like thunder. The wide treads bit into the earth, pushing the tank forward with slow, deliberate power. The Germans watched as it glided over the terrain, its suspension flexing and adjusting with uncanny smoothness. The Christie suspension, an American design adopted and improved by the Soviets, absorbed the shock of uneven ground effortlessly. The wide tracks distributed its weight evenly, preventing it from sinking into the snow. The tank seemed almost alive, flowing rather than fighting against the landscape. Kruger noted every motion. The drive sprockets turned without strain, The transmission responded cleanly, and the diesel engine maintained power without faltering. Even as the snow deepened, the T-34 plowed forward, unstoppable. The German trucks parked nearby looked fragile in comparison, mechanical ornaments beside this iron survivor. The engineers followed its trail, measuring pressure imprints, track width, and ground penetration. The data revealed a brutal truth. The T-34's footprint was nearly half that of a comparable German tank. Its efficiency wasn't just mechanical, it was environmental. It worked with the earth, not against it. In the afternoon, the tank was driven back to camp. The metal hissed as the heat of the engine met the cold air. Frost melted off its armor in rivulets that steamed against the bitter wind. The Germans gathered around it, silent, their notebooks heavy with contradictions. Kruger, usually meticulous in his language, found himself struggling to describe what he was seeing. Every principle of design he had been taught, precision, optimization, refinement, failed to explain how this rough machine could outperform the masterpieces of German engineering. The T-34's genius wasn't in what it perfected, but in what it abandoned. It sacrificed speed for endurance, elegance for practicality, precision for reliability. It was not a tank for engineers, it was a tank for survivors. When they disassembled the suspension later that day, their respect deepened further. The components were coarse but solid, built for replacement in the field. The bearings were oversized, the welds thick, the parts standardized to an extreme degree. A Soviet mechanic with frozen fingers could fix this machine in a trench with a wrench and a hammer. Something unthinkable for a German Panther or Tiger. As the evening fell, a fire was lit near the tank. The Germans gathered around, their faces lit by the orange glow reflecting off the steel hull. The wind howled across the steppe, carrying with it the endless cold, and still the T-34 stood there, its engine ticking faintly as it cooled, the smell of diesel lingering in the air, like the scent of endurance itself. In that moment, the engineers knew they were not merely studying a tank. They were staring at the embodiment of a doctrine, a way of thinking that could not be replicated with equations or blueprints. The Soviets had built something that reflected their people, battered, imperfect, yet indestructible. And as the German engineers packed their notes for the night, one unspoken realization hung heavy among them. That perhaps the greatest weapon in this war was not the machine that could move the fastest or hit the hardest, but the one that refused to stop moving at all. By the eighth day, the German engineers no longer felt as though they were conducting tests. They were witnesses to revelation. The T-34, which had arrived as a captured enemy prize, had transformed into something almost mythic in their eyes, a symbol of endurance that defied logic and humbled pride. Its engine had survived conditions that killed men. Its movement conquered terrain that devoured the finest German machines, and its crude simplicity had proven a kind of perfection no blueprint could improve. The snow had deepened overnight, swallowing tire tracks and half-burying the camp's equipment. The air was sharp and metallic, every breath cutting the lungs like glass. The engineers began their day with stiff fingers and frost-bitten cheeks, trudging toward the T-34 that waited like a sleeping predator in the whiteness. The frost that covered its armor sparkled faintly under the pale sun. It looked less like a tank now and more like a monument, a survivor of both battle and winter. Their next task was endurance under stress. They would push the Soviet diesel engine to its limits, running it continuously for 12 hours without pause or maintenance. The goal was simple: to see when, if ever, it would fail. At dawn, they filled the tank's reserves with the last of their captured Soviet fuel and began the test. The engine came alive instantly, the low growl of its cylinders rolling through the air with measured strength. Within minutes, a plume of exhaust rose, and the snow began to melt beneath its hull once again. The air around it shimmered with heat, an island of life in a frozen wasteland. Hours passed. The gauges barely wavered. The oil temperature remained stable. The coolant circulated flawlessly, and the vibrations stayed even. The Germans monitored every dial, every note, every pulse of the machine. They had expected strain, the slow degradation of performance. Instead, the T-34 seemed to settle into rhythm. The longer it ran, the smoother it became, as though it thrived on endurance itself. As midday faded to dusk, the engineers began to notice small details that spoke to the Soviet design philosophy in its purest form. The cooling vents were wide and simple, able to clear frost through sheer airflow. The thick armor surrounding the engine trapped just enough heat to prevent freezing. The heavy steel acted like insulation, protecting the heart of the machine from the lethal cold outside. In contrast, the German vehicles nearby, unused, silent, and perfectly engineered, sat frozen, their fuel thickened into sludge. The Maybach engines, even when heated, required careful coaxing to function. One of the engineers attempted to start a Panzer engine just to compare results. It failed almost immediately, the pistons seizing within moments. The sound of its stutter was pathetic beside the steady thunder of the T-34. By nightfall, the test was complete. The Soviet diesel had run for 12 straight hours without faltering once. The metal was hot to the touch, radiating warmth into the air around it. The snow nearest the hull had melted into deep puddles, which steamed faintly under the bitter wind. When they finally cut the engine, the silence that followed felt enormous. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The German engineers stood still, listening to the soft ticking of cooling metal. They could see their reflections faintly in the blackened armor. Men of precision, of pride, now reduced to awe. They had spent their lives designing machines meant to dominate battlefields through superiority of form and function. But this Soviet creation had revealed a brutal truth. Perfection was a luxury of peace. In war, what mattered most was the refusal to break. Kruger wrote the day's report by lamplight. His handwriting was unsteady from the cold, but his thoughts were clear. He noted that the T-34's engine, far from primitive, represented a new kind of engineering, one that understood suffering, one born not in laboratories, but in the fields and factories of a nation perpetually at war with both enemies and nature. Outside, the tank rested in silence, still steaming against the winter night. The stars glimmered above like ice in a wind mown through the trees. The Germans had seen many wonders of machinery in their time, sleek, powerful, perfect creations, but none that seemed so alive, so defiant, so utterly human. In its crude simplicity, the T-34 carried the spirit of survival itself. By the ninth day, the German engineers had stopped calling it a test altogether. The T-34 had proven itself beyond question, not through numbers or measurements, but through endurance. It had survived every trial the bitter Russian winter could conjure. It had faced the cold, the storms, the snow, and the endless cycle of freezing nights and dim gray dawns. And it had not failed once. The camp around it, however, was a picture of exhaustion. Tools were frozen to tables, oil drums buried in snow, and the engineers themselves looked older, their faces gaunt, their eyes rimmed with sleepless fascination. Each man had come here to prove a point. That German design, with all its refinement and power, was the pinnacle of modern engineering. But after days in the presence of this Soviet machine, none of them believed that anymore. The morning began in silence. Frost covered every surface, glinting like shards of glass in the weak sunlight. The T-34 stood in the open field, its armor layered with ice so thick it looked sculpted from the winter itself. The Germans planned one final test, to measure how the engine handled an extreme cold start after full exposure. They would leave it untouched for 24 hours in temperatures below minus 35 degrees Celsius, then attempt to restart it without assistance, heating, or preparation. They waited. The night came, colder than any before. The wind screamed through the trees and the temperature dropped so far that the very air seemed to freeze. Metal creaked and groaned across the camp. The German vehicles were now little more than statues, their components brittle, their fluids solidified into useless crystals. Inside the barracks, the men huddled around stoves, listening to the sound of the storm battering the walls. When dawn returned, pale and merciless, the camp was half buried in snow. The engineers emerged into the blinding light, their boots sinking into the drifts. Their breath hung heavy, their hands barely able to grip their instruments. The T-34 stood where they had left it, still, silent, its shape softened by snow. To the untrained eye, it looked dead. The frost on its hull was so thick it seemed fused to the ground. Yet when the lead engineer brushed away the snow from the driver's hatch and turned the crank, something miraculous happened. At first, there was nothing. The cold swallowed the sound. Then faintly, the slow grind of metal on metal broke the silence. The crank turned again, and again. A deep rumble stirred beneath the armor. One cylinder fired, then another and another, until the entire engine came alive in a roar that shattered the stillness of the morning. Steam burst from the exhaust in violent plumes, and the snow around the tank melted in seconds. The T-34 shuddered as it warmed, the vibrations sending avalanches of frost falling from its sides. Within minutes, the engine was running steadily, its pulse strong and sure. The Germans stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. There was no longer disbelief, only respect. In the face of such endurance, their own machines seemed fragile, almost decadent. The T-34 was not beautiful, nor elegant, but it possessed a kind of grace that only necessity could create. It was a weapon designed by experience, not theory, a product of a people who had no choice but to survive. Kruger approached the tank, his breath fogging the air. He placed a gloved hand on the armor, feeling the warmth beneath the steel. He thought of the thousands of these machines scattered across the vast Soviet Union, each one carrying that same indomitable spirit. He imagined them advancing across frozen plains, through forests and fields, unstoppable not because they were perfect, but because they refused to stop. That night, as the engineers packed their notes for transport back to Berlin, Kruger wrote his final entry. He described the T-34 as a machine that understands the world it lives in. Its designers had not built it to impress. They had built it to endure hunger, mud, and frost. In doing so, they had created something that outlasted logic itself. The German camp fell silent once more as the sun sank behind the white horizon. The only sound left was the faint ticking of the T-34's cooling metal, a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. And in that frozen stillness, every man present understood the quiet truth that no one dared say aloud. The Soviets had built not just a tank, but the future. The 10th day dawned beneath a sky of dull silver, the horizon a blur of endless snow and smoke. The German engineers rose in silence, each man aware that this would be their final day with the machine that had upended everything they thought they knew about engineering, about war, and perhaps even about survival itself. The camp was quiet except for the crunch of boots in the frost and the occasional hiss of steam from the generator. The T-34 stood where it always had, its dark silhouette rising from the snow like a monument to endurance. The engine was cold now, its metal sheathed in a crust of ice, but there was something defiant about its stillness, as if it was merely waiting to wake again when called upon. This last day was meant for documentation. Every measurement, every diagram, every observation they had gathered would be compiled and sent back to Berlin. They took meticulous notes: dimensions, materials, tolerances, temperatures, oil viscosities, and wear patterns. The data alone was staggering, but numbers could not capture what the men had truly witnessed. They measured the thickness of the armor plates, not perfectly even, but sufficient, the welding rough but unbreakable. They weighed the components, studying the balance between weight and performance. They mapped the engine's design, tracing every fuel line and piston, every vent and cooling channel. And as they worked, the same realization deepened. The T-34 was a masterpiece not because of precision, but because of purpose. It had been built for soldiers who had no luxury of time, for battles fought in mud and snow, for campaigns that stretched into oblivion. Its wide tracks, sloped armor, and forgiving engine made it as much a survivor as any human who fought beside it. It did not demand perfection from its operators. It met them halfway, enduring their mistakes, their exhaustion, their desperation. By midday, the light began to fade, the sun disappearing behind a curtain of snow. Kruger stood apart from the others, his notes complete, watching as the T-34 gleamed faintly in the dim light. He thought of the countless hours spent in German factories perfecting machines that could not survive the world they were sent into. The Tigers and Panthers were marvels of science, powerful, complex, fragile. The T-34 was none of those things, and yet it would still be moving long after the others froze in their tracks. He approached the tank one final time, brushing the frost from its armor. Beneath his glove, the steel was as cold as stone, yet it carried the memory of heat, of power, of life. He realized then that this machine was more than the sum of its parts. It was a reflection of the people who had built it, unyielding, practical, unbreakable. That evening, as the engineers prepared to leave, the T-34 was started once more for a final test. The crank turned, the diesel rumbled, and once again, in the heart of a Russian winter, the engine came to life as easily as if it were summer. Its roar filled the valley, echoing through the forest, the same defiant rhythm that had shaken the Eastern Front. The snow around it melted into steaming puddles, and for a moment the German engineers simply stood and watched. There was no laughter now, no arrogance, only quiet respect. They had spent a lifetime chasing mechanical perfection, and here, in the simplicity of a Soviet tank, they had found something far greater, endurance beyond understanding. When the tank was shut down for the last time, the silence that followed was immense. The Germans packed their instruments and climbed into their trucks, leaving the T-34 behind in the snow. As the convoy pulled away, Kruger looked back through the frost on the window and saw it standing there, alone, unshaken, eternal. He knew that long after they were gone, when the war had burned itself out and the names of tanks and generals were forgotten, machines like this would still be remembered, not for their beauty, but for their will to live. And somewhere in that frozen expanse of the Eastern Front, the sound of the T-34's engine, deep, rough, alive, would linger forever, echoing across history as proof that survival itself is the greatest form of brilliance. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.